This interview was just released on our other podcast, Next Economy Now. I'm sharing it here because Ries' new book, Incorruptible, is one of the most important books for the B Corp movement that I've read in a long time. Eric is a uniquely compelling messenger for this conversation. Through his authorship of The Lean Startup, he has one foot firmly in the mainstream tech, startup, and business worlds. He understands venture capital, scaling, IPOs, boards, and the pressures that shape high-growth companies from the inside. At the same time, Incorruptible puts him in deep conversation with the mission and purpose-driven worlds of Patagonia, Tony's Chocolonely, Mondragon, and other organizations trying to design companies that can stay true over generations. As you'll hear in this conversation, getting certified as a B Corp and becoming a benefit corporation is not enough anymore. If B Corps want to protect their purpose as they grow, raise capital, face investor pressure, or even think about moving into public markets, they have to get even more creative about mission lock, ownership, governance, and accountability. Eric's work invites us to think about how we design companies that can remain accountable to stakeholders for 50, 100, or even more years into the future. So without further ado, here's my interview with Eric Ries. Welcome to Next Economy Now. The goal of this podcast series is to highlight the leaders who are taking a regenerative, bioregional, equitable, democratic, racially just, and whole systems approach to creating the new economy. I'm Ryan Honeyman, a partner at Lyft Economy, and my guest today is Eric Ries. Over the last 2 decades, Eric's ideas about continuous innovation, long-term thinking, governance, and market reform have reshaped company building and management practices. He's the creator of the Lean Startup Method and the author of the New York Times bestseller, The Lean Startup, The Leader's Guide, and The Startup Way. As a founder, he has put his own ideas into practice with the Long-Term Stock Exchange, Answer.ai, which is an AI R&D lab, the Lean Startup Company, which teaches and supports the implementation of Lean Startup, Virgil, a legal services startup, and IMVU, where the ideas that became the Lean Startup Method were forged. On his podcast, The Eric Ries Show, which you all should subscribe to, he talks to guests, including world-class technologists, thought leaders, and executives working to build profitable companies for the long-term benefit of society. Eric has served as an entrepreneur in residence at Harvard Business School and IDEO. He lives in the San Francisco Bay Area with his wife and 3 kids. Eric, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me.
I want to invite you to first share about your background, just to give a sense about folks to understand who you are. So how did you first get into the work you're doing today?
I came up as a technologist. So I was in my parents' bedroom programming computers, when I probably should have been outside playing with other kids. That was my background. And I thought technology was like the most powerful force in the universe. And I got a computer science degree. I did a startup from my dorm room during the dot-com bubble. Like I really wanted to have the Silicon Valley future. And the only problem was I kept building these companies. I was the CTO. Like I would write the software myself and then nobody would use it. So I just never was lucky enough to have the like fairy tale thing you see in the movies, where it just works out on the first try. I kept having these experiences where I just felt like the management practices, the way we were taught to build and structure these organizations didn't make sense for the entrepreneurial realities that I was seeing. So I started to develop alternate ideas, originally borrowing from lean manufacturing and design thinking and customer development and DevOps and all these different places, melded them together to create something called Lean Startup. And that really changed my life. That was first a blog post and then a movement and eventually a book that came out in 2011, where I tried to argue for a more humanistic, a more scientific, more iterative and customer-centric way of building companies. Now that book became a huge phenomenon and international bestseller and took over my life. And I feel like I got issued like a backstage pass to business, which is unimaginably vast. It's so much bigger than anyone realizes. And so I got to travel all over the world and meet big companies and small companies and governments and NGOs and put these management ideas into practice. So that's how I got into this work. And what's interesting, we'll talk obviously about what came after, because my daily practice, almost like a martial art, kata, like my daily practice is helping people with their organization. So people call me like almost every day, starting a new company or raising a Series A or in a sticky situation in a growth stage, or they're already public or going public, or they're a big company and they want to revitalize. So I've just had the chance to put these ideas into practice in every conceivable kind of industry, sector, stage, age of company, you name it, I've seen it. And so as a result, I feel like I've gotten a really broad perspective on what's working and what's not working in our financial system across the board. And as your listeners, I'm sure, no doubt are aware, it's not really working that well.
Yeah. And maybe could you jump to the LTSE and then maybe what sort of led to the actual writing of this new book that you're about to release?
Sure, yeah. If you grab your beat up old copy of The Lean Startup and you turn to almost the very last page, there's an epilogue at the end in which I did my favorite thing as an author in those days. Instead of having to build things myself as an entrepreneur, which is a lot of work, you get to say as an author that somebody should really do something, which is a lot easier. So you put it out, I just wrote a bunch of ideas. People should do this. We should change, we got to change business education. We got to change how the entrepreneur ecosystem works. We change how venture funding works, change how we hold people accountable in an entrepreneurial situation, all kinds of stuff. But one of the last ideas in the book, I said somebody should really build a long-term stock exchange because we know from the evidence. I had spent a lot of time studying Toyota production system and lean manufacturing. And in that research set, it's eminently clear and viewed as completely obvious that companies that have a long-term philosophy, a philosophy of long-term thinking, make more money. They have a competitively stronger position. And there's also a lot of good evidence that long-term ownership base, like if your cap table has long-term investors on it, you also reap all these competitive advantages. Meanwhile, those investors who invest for the long term reap all kinds of rewards also. So it seemed to me very obvious that we should be able to bring together long-term owners and long-term companies for mutual benefit, and that we would all make more money if we did that. So that was the idea of the long-term stock exchange. And that's why I know so much about financial systems and about corporate governance and all these obscure areas of the law and financial regulation. It forced me to really, really go deep. And just like I had experience with the management best practices I'd been taught growing up, our governance best practices seem to me to be almost universally value destroying. And so a lot of the things that I was taught didn't make sense to me. I'd be like, that doesn't seem intuitively right, but all these Mandarins say so they must know what they're talking about. They're very wise. And so I was trying my very best to follow their recommendations. But the more I did that, the worse things got. And so in the course of building LTSE, I really got to see the best and worst of our financial system up close. I feel like it was really my personal journey into the heart of darkness. And although that wasn't a very pleasant experience, and although we came out of it and we did survive, LTSE still exists to this day. We actually had a profitable year. We made some money, like, wow, incredible. I felt like I had learned too much and I was having trouble helping the people I would encounter because people would ask me for advice. I'm preparing for an IPO. How can I protect my mission? And so I got a lot of practice being like, okay, let me help you. Let's try it. Let's put some of these. And the more and more and more you try to get people off the best practices path, the more you realize how vicious the status quo can be. Status quo is a phrase that makes it sound very passive, very gentle, and just the way things are. Oh no, status quo throws quite a punch. So, over the course of quite a number of years, I got pretty good at helping people dodge those blows and eventually to land a few of their own, to be able to adopt ideas that when they first came to see me, they would have thought were radical, but by the time we're done, seemed common sense. So like all my books, this new book comes out of my personal experience trying to help people get onto this better path. But it also contains all the research that you would ever want about how do we get into this situation and what can we do about it? What is our collective agency to forge a different path? I'm pretty excited about it.
Yeah, so maybe for folks who are listening, whether it's like social entrepreneurs, B Corp leaders, activists, MBA students, impact investors, folks trying to build the next economy. And, to be honest, there's probably not as many people who are listening who are ever going to IPO anything, but they are very interested in mission lock and mission protection because that is still a huge thing for them, especially if people want to raise money. So what's sort of the main message, or maybe describe what's some of the most important concepts that you think someone who sort of already knows, like, yeah, this system is terrible, what can they take away or what can they look forward to when reading the book?
So the biggest thing I learned, I interviewed tons and tons of mission-driven leaders, like many of whom are just like you're describing, not going public or even aspiring to go public. So I really got a sense of like, what are people's self-concept when they're doing this? And one of my biggest takeaways is that Even though we say we're on a different path, we say we have rejected the values of this system, we are nonetheless unconsciously adopting its values anyway. It is pernicious. I call this force financial gravity. You can tell me you don't believe in gravity, but gravity believes in you. As it proves, every time you jump up in the air, you're coming right back down to earth. Well, organizations face their own fundamental forces that act on them, whether we want them to or not. And one of them is the fact that when we exist in a financialized economy, finance transmits values unconsciously. So, for example, many of the mission-driven leaders, and if you watch the Eric Ries show, like I do, I have interviews, I did them on the record. You can just read, you watch. They'll say things like, I'll say, look, you seem like you've taken a really different path here. Do you recommend it? And they'll be like, oh, I don't know. Sure, it worked for us, but I'm really sorry. We kind of don't follow the best practices. Like, I'm not sure. They really have this like sense of self-flagellation, or even they'll go out of their way to point out the drawbacks and the problems, like way out of proportion to what is necessary. And a lot of the problems that they name are not even problems at all. They'll be like, well, we're not perfect. Like, oh, I see. Whereas someone else is perfect. Like, yeah, no, you're not. But we live in such a polarized age. Like we now are reached a point where if people claim to be trying to do the right thing, they get a lot of skepticism and pushback. That's just virtue signaling. You're just this, that's not. Blah, 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 blah. And so as a result, people live in this defensive crouch. So that's one thing we really got to fix is we got to get much more confident about saying what we are for. But I think having worked on this for a long time now, part of my conclusion is that we're much more articulate saying what is wrong with the current economy. We're actually not that good at explaining the new, what you call the next economy. What is our affirmative vision of where we are headed? And it's really interesting to me. Part of this book is about the history of how we got here. So people in our world love to bash Milton Friedman. Everyone knows that famous 1970 op-ed, the social purpose of companies is to increase its own profits. If you study the language and the strategy of those guys, what I call the shareholder primacy crew, who made this change, this monumental change in the world without any democratic oversight or legitimacy, just through pure persuasion. Notice what they didn't do. They never once said, you know what we need? We need two different kinds of companies. There's the old style company that are built around purpose. We're going to introduce a new kind of corporation, the E Corp, the extractive corporation. And we're going to try to convince people you should switch over from the old corp to this. Never. Milton never wrote one essay being like, I think some people should really consider trying to do the right thing every once in a while. No, he wrote, this is what business is. It was a philosophical argument trying to reclaim the definitions of key words in business. It was a conceptual vocabulary attack, and it worked, but we don't respond in kind. We're talking about double bottom line, triple bottom line. Someone the other day was like, why did you redefine what profit means in your book? Why don't you just introduce a fourth to bottom line? You have quadruple bottom. I was like, we don't need any more bottom lines. We got too many. So I'm a big believer that we can be a lot, now that we have the evidence, we've been at this for a while, like as a movement, I'm Johnny come lately here, okay? Like people have been working on this for a while. They've laid the groundwork and we have the evidence. We actually have the old economy dead to rights. The people who are trying to justify shareholder primacy, like their arguments are terrible. We have way better arguments. We have the data. We have everything you need, but we haven't yet really taken up the attack. And for all the progress that we've made, think about all the groups that are out there, conscious capitalism, B Corps, B Labs, and the evergreen folks, the Tugboat Foundation, the Short Fast Foundation, what's happening with Patagonia. I mean, it's just like there's so many people doing so much amazing work. I can't even give credit to all of them because I can't even remember and keep track. There's so many. I work with entrepreneurs every single day. And the truth is, the vast majority of entrepreneurs that call me for advice have never heard of any of this. They don't even know the difference between a B Corp certification and a public benefit corp. So the gap, when I said business is unimaginably vast, the number of people who've been exposed to this new idea is very small still. So if you're listening to this, you are part of a really radical vanguard. Congratulations, you have a sneak peek of where this is headed. I actually think the era of shareholder primacy is already over. Because during the advent of shareholder primacy...
Say more about that.
Two reasons I think it's that way. First of all, it's an idea that has been poised for a while for its own intellectual collapse. It is intellectually incoherent. So it could never really sustain itself over a long period of time. You can read Lynn Stouter. There's a lot of people who've taken it to the mat. But they've lost two really important things. First of all, originally the theory of shareholder primacy is that it would benefit shareholders. But the evidence is in. We've had it long enough where it really doesn't benefit shareholders. What it does is it locks shareholders into a prisoner's dilemma I call it not shareholder primacy, but extraction primacy. If everybody thinks everybody else is going to try to squeeze all the value out of a company and then get out, you need to squeeze first and get out before they do. So the game theory vice that it has trapped investors in is quite bad. And it also has not just a moral problem, which makes no sense. Like the idea that an organization is not a vital, beautiful, living organism, but a mere financial instrument for the enrichment of some, like that's absurd. Nobody who builds things for a living actually thinks that way. And we've all been told that we're not allowed to say so out loud. So for example, if you read the people who justify, like there's kind of a confusing thing in the legal literature about shareholder primacy. Why is shareholder primacy the law of the land when it has not been subject to any kind of legislative act? It's actually kind of a very strange law. So if you read, people can't even agree on whether it is the law or isn't the law. But practically speaking, oh, it is. Like if you've ever tried to deviate from this rule, you will be spanked. Okay. So it's the law. But if people try to figure out why, they write these convoluted legal essays that are like, shareholder primacy is not a legal obligation, but it is a legal duty. You're like, oh, super helpful. Thanks for clearing that up. Right. Like, okay. But one of the most interesting things about it is what they settle on is the idea that, well, it may not be a legislative law, but it is what's called a normative consensus. All managers and directors and investors have come to an agreement that this is not just what organizations do. That would be a descriptive consensus. This is a normative consensus. This is our consensus about what they should do. So in the book, I asked the reader, are you part of this normative consensus? Almost every person I have asked this question to says, oh, no, absolutely not. I'm like, good. Have you told anybody that you're not part of the consensus? And they're like, oh, no, I everyone around me is part of it. I'd be too dangerous to say so. It's like, well, is it possible that they are thinking just like you? They're afraid to say it too. So one of the things I urge people to do is, not everyone's super brave and wants to be an activist. I get it. It's okay. You got a business to run. Like, you don't have to go stand up on your boardroom table and scream about this. But tomorrow, would you be willing to tell one friend, just, hi, I'm not part of the normative consensus in favor of shareholder primacy? Just could you say it out loud? You might find that your friend says, oh, yeah, me neither. Huh, good to know. So we've kind of lost that it's lost this intellectual argument that is like its real foundation was that it's supposed to create value for investors, but it's destroying value for investors. We have a lot of data. It's also lost a generational argument. So if you talk to young people about this idea, they can't even understand what you're talking about. They've only lived in a world dominated by this idea, and they've seen nothing but an institutional collapse. So the fact that this idea also leads to weak institutions that cannot defend their values is really obvious to the younger generation. So in a very funny turn of events, I showed the book to a University of Chicago economics professor, okay? And I wasn't sure how it was going to go. I was like, hey, man, I think I want to get your feedback, but I understand this might not be your jam. And he was actually I really thank him. He was really very kind about it. He was, I actually like this book. Many of the points you're making are well established in the research. We've known this in economics for years. There's all these problems that are not being addressed. I'm really pleased. He's like, but you're way too harsh on capitalism itself, man. And he's like, look, private equity creates more value. And he's just like, yeah. Like you're being, and I was like, that's interesting you say that because I don't really use the word capitalism at all in my book. I don't really talk about it. I was like, you've projected something onto here. You read this evidence in this book as an indictment of the system you support. Isn't that interesting? But anyway, I was like, look, with all respect, you're a little bit older. When I share this book with young people, I've had 2 different young people say to me, this is the first book I've ever read that defends capitalism. In the younger generation, this argument is over. So our societal institutions, as those people get older, they will either adjust themselves to that new reality or they're not going to tolerate these institutions. There's going to be a substantial amount of institutional turnover if we're not careful. So yeah, I think the era is extraction primacy is what we're living in now. And our responsibility as a movement, we need to start to give people an affirmative vision of what the new thing we're entering into. And I've been advocating for the idea of mission primacy, that we should try to build mission-controlled organizations and restore corporations to the historical balance. For the vast majority of time, there have been joint stock corporations. It was seen as obvious that corporations should exist to fulfill a specific purpose, and even a beneficial purpose, meaning beneficial to society, such that in the 19th century, if you had tried to take over a railroad or a company that was designed to make a specific thing, and you decided after you took it over to change its purpose from make a railroad to enrich its shareholders, that would be considered a crime, and the courts would void your charter. So this is in some way, sense, a restoration of the proper role of corporations in our society. And I think it's something people are going to get excited of if we can paint for them an affirmative vision of where we're going, not just a critique of where we've been.
It's fascinating because I remember maybe 15 years ago, One of the lawyers who's helped move the B Corp movement forward had done research about corporations in England, like corporation meaning the body, and like the king was like the head in like England
Uh-huh.
back in the day, and so you had to have a sort of charter to be existing, and so cutting off the head without the sort of wisdom of the crown, like making sure you stayed true. We basically have a bunch of headless corporations running around now.
We have literally created a generation of zombies.
Yeah.
And then we're like, why is trust in institutions declined? It's like, well, do you trust zombies? I sure don't.
Well, maybe we could jump into some of those mission lock, or, you talk about spiritual holding companies and the constellations, a lot of like galaxy references. I love it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Why don't you give folks some insight into like, okay, so we know the problem. Now here's what I looked at in the book and here's what are some solutions.
The book is actually only a little bit about the problem and really much more about the solution. And what I think the solution is, like every technique in the book, just to preface this, every technique in the book is something you can do right now today. Okay, there's not a single thing in the book that I'm like, hey, after the revolution, then you can. No, I only wanted to write about things that we know work. So there's academic research to support that it works, where we have case studies that I could personally tell you, here's a story of this idea in action so you could see how it works. And most importantly, it's something that you can do today. I basically think that corruption happens when organizations lose their connection to their purpose, or when the purpose becomes corroded and moves away from maximizing human flourishing. So an incorruptible company has this special combination of a real powerful internal alignment around a singular purpose that is aligned to human flourishing. And it is protected by a governance structure that gives it structural integrity, so that it can not just not be tempted, it cannot be pressured. Those are really the themes of the book, are like the problem of temptation and the problem of pressure. So it doesn't really matter to me if your board betrays you, or investors betray you, or a private equity takes you over, or someone stages a boardroom coup. From my point of view, I don't care. Like which of those problems, all those problems lead to the same outcome, the cracking open of the shell by financial gravity, which then brings the organization back down into mediocrity. So to do that, I conceive of the blueprint as kind of having two halves. The first half is what I call the path of ethos. That's the path of alignment and internal integrity and purpose, and the path of integrity, meaning not just the ability to keep a promise, like you would say about a person, a high integrity person. If they say they're going to do something, they'll do it, but also the ability to have structural integrity, like a building or a bridge. When you see a bridge collapse, if you're talking to an engineer and you say, hey, why did that bridge collapse? If the engineer says, well, gravity, what'd you expect? You'd be like, no, that's not a very, like, yes, that's technically true, right? Like, why did companies get corroded? Why does corruption happen? Well, because financial gravity is pulling at them. So that is true, but it's not very helpful because you say, well, wasn't there gravity yesterday when it didn't collapse? And what about these 29 other bridges? They didn't collapse. They are like, of course, gravity is a universal constant. It doesn't mean we can't build strong bridges. So instead, an engineer would say, no, we've studied the load factor. We've studied the wind shear. We've studied the material tension. We've studied, oh, look, there's corrosion on the joints. No wonder it collapsed, right? So to me, like corruption is a kind of corrosion in our economy. And what we're trying to do is study what are those factors that allow us to build strong organizations. So just to kind of give some examples, like everyone I'm sure listening knows Patagonia. Patagonia is like the classic strong ethos company that like stands for something very particular. And now, of course, mostly about environmental activism. But the original impulse of Patagonia was about quality. Yvon Chouinard is a guy who hand forged, he taught himself blacksmithing so he could hand forge his own carabiners because the ones he was climbing with weren't good enough. And he used to drive his employees crazy because he would do these classes where he'd sit people down and say, you take like a bag of Pete's coffee and he'd put it on the table and say, is this a high quality product? And like any normal person would say, well, doesn't that depend if you like coffee or not? And you're like, no, wrong. Quality is an objective attribute of a product. The product has the quality it deserves. What's the highest quality piece of clothing you can think of? And someone would say, I don't know, a fancy Italian dress shirt? Wrong. If you put that dress shirt in the washing machine a couple times, now is it high quality? Like he had just such an uncompromising, absolutely like rigid idea about what is quality. And that uncompromising humanism led him into environmental activism, which he came to relatively late in life compared to his obsession with carabiners. What's interesting about that story, now it's easy to kind of lionize Patagonia because they've been so successful. But Patagonia was, as you well know, a very badly run company. So why did it succeed? If you read the stories, the histories of it, they didn't succeed through their tremendous business acumen. They succeeded because having this ethos unlocks these superpowers, these powers of alignment. It makes people want to be part of what you're doing and they're willing to forgive your mistakes, gives you the strength and courage to do stuff you wouldn't otherwise be able to do. And it creates selection bias. The people for whom, like when they wrote that famous ad that said everything we make pollutes, I'm sure there's some people who were offended, but obviously way more people were like, that's the kind of company I can trust. That's who I want to be part of. So I like them as an exemplar of that. Because they have that cohesion, they've been able to resist temptation many times. And some of those stories are relatively famous. I think people generally know about Black Wednesday, when the company overexpanded into, Asian and other outsourcing manufacturing procedures, just like everybody else was in the 90s and 2000s. It was the hot thing. They got swept up in the best practices. Even the good companies get swept up sometimes. Overexpanded, quality declined, sales went down. They had to lay a bunch of people off, and they were in crisis. They had to renegotiate their bank loans. And this is one of my favorite little tidbits, just to give you a sense of like how even those of us who are mission driven are like on the verge of capitulation at all times. We just can't help it. We've been conditioned that way. Your mom was no longer the CEO at the time that this happened. They had to renegotiate their bank loans, and the bank came to them and said, listen, we'll do it. Here's the new structure. They negotiated everything. So it's like one last thing. Just during the time of the turnaround, okay, while you're spending the money we're loaning you to get the company back on its feet, we need you to suspend your nonprofit donations. Because look, it made sense. You were donating your profits before, fair enough. But now you're not profitable. You're going to be loaning our money. So like maybe the most reasonable request you can ever imagine of like nothing. I think a lot of people would say yes to that without a second thought. Last condition. CEO of Patagonia said, no dice. Sorry, you must misunderstand. The purpose of this is to save Patagonia and not to destroy it. And they understood that even the smallest compromise was a betrayal of their ethos. And what's wild about that story is a lot of mission-driven companies do not understand their own power. So by turning it around on the bank, they put the bank in an impossible situation. Because the bank was like, we're going to get what we want because it's the last thing. One last thing. What, are they going to blow up the whole deal over one last thing? That cuts both ways. Now Patagonia puts the bank in that situation. Are you going to blow up the deal over one last thing? Really? Now it helps that because their customers and their employees and like so many people love Patagonia that they actually they had individual people signing up to give them loans if they needed it. Like their strength was powered by a community of people who loved them, not just their clever corporate strategy. So that's when I say ethos, that's the kind of thing I'm talking about. When I say integrity, there's a lot of great integrity stories in the book, but one of my favorites that I don't think is as well known not as well known as Patagonia, certainly, and kind of not that known in the US is Tony's Chocolonely. You know Tony's?
Yeah.
Yeah. Because such a cool company.
They're good. They're big in the B Corp movement as well.
Yeah, they're really great. And the chocolate is delicious and they're growing in the US. So people in the US who I've told this story to, like people have seen it in the store, but a lot of people don't know the story. Well, the original story, the founder of Tony's Chocolonely, the canonical Tony, he was a television journalist in the Netherlands. And he tried to get himself arrested for eating chocolate, which, that's an unusual thing to do. But he was trying to make a point. He had done a big TV expose about child labor and child slavery in the cacao supply chain, and nobody cared. And he was asking everybody, like, the Dutch eat a lot of chocolate. If we're all eating chocolate, aren't we complicit in the creation of this slavery? Well, the authorities predictably refused to arrest him for eating chocolate. So they arrested him. They'd have to arrest the whole population. They're not going to do that. And he felt frustrated. He was like, I just don't believe. He was interviewing people and they said, well, the reason why the public doesn't care, the reason why no one does anything about this is because the public doesn't care. It's like, I just don't believe that. And they did a classic MVP. They decided to create 5,000 fair trade certified chocolate bars and they sold like 15,000 in a week. It was like overnight they sold them out. So he left journalism and became an entrepreneur and they built this company, Tony's Chocolonely, who has the mission to eradicate child slavery in the supply chain. And I won't get into the whole story. Like for people in the US, even people who are not in the B Corp movement have eaten Tony's chocolate because they do something called Tony's Open Chain. They're actually in a lot of other chocolate products. For example, if your kids like Mr. Beast and have eaten his chocolate is sourced from Tony's. And the reason they've been having such an outsized impact is that when you use their supply chain, you can't cherry pick. So if you want to use they'll basically solve your ethical supply chain for you if you want to have an ethical chocolate bar. But then all the chocolate you sell has to live up to their standards. So it's kind of got this very clever strategy to bring. Anyway, I bring all that up because people say, well, that sounds great, but I'm sure Tony's just a really exceptional person. But no, he doesn't even run the company anymore. He felt after a while that being a journalist required him to divest himself of Tony's because he wanted to be able to speak out and he didn't want to be encumbered by the company's shareholders. So even though Tony's became very quickly the number one chocolate brand in the Netherlands, it's big in a lot of European countries, it's growing a lot in the US, it has had to raise money. So it has investors. It's been through multiple CEOs since he was involved. He's not involved at all anymore. Instead, the control of the company was passed something they call Tony's mission lock, which is an instance of something I call the spiritual holding company in the book, a separate legal entity that has the mission oversight responsibility for the for-profit subsidiary. And I introduced the term spiritual holding company because we actually don't have, shocking to me, we as a movement do not have an omnibus term for this particular relationship. The combination of a for-profit engine with a not-for-profit or trustee-based oversight mechanism. And as a result, there's a lot of different people advocating for a lot of different flavors of this. Obviously, you can do it with a purpose trust. You can do it with what's called an industrial foundation, like a lot of European companies are structured, but also a lot of, like even American companies structured that way. You can do it as an employee ownership trust or an ESOP, the way Taylor's Guitars is structured, or the way that John Lewis Partnership is structured in the UK. You could do it as a cooperative or a series of cooperatives like Mondragon in the north of Spain, or like Vanguard if you have a Vanguard mutual fund. And what's interesting about these companies that have this spiritual holding company structure, this is, I think, very commonly misunderstood. People think the ethical, positive externality nature, the ethos of the company is driven from the structure. But this is wrong. The structure guarantees only stability and longevity. So, for example, Hershey's chocolate has this structure. Does that mean I would rather eat Hershey's chocolate than Tony Chocolonely? Hell no. But if you look what happened to Cadbury, which used to be a moral enterprise, was taken over by Kraft and has lost everything that made it special. In the UK, they called it the Great Chocolate Betrayal. Like the Cadbury cream eggs don't even have any chocolate in them anymore. The same people that tried to do that to Cadbury tried to do it to Hershey, but they haven't been able to. So that's why I say it's a two-part process. First step is to build trustworthiness as an asset, to build something worth protecting. And only then does it make sense to embody that asset in a vault, in a fortress, in the right structure that can give it the integrity to resist the outside pressure.
The classic example from the B Corp world is Whole Foods, which I know you talk about in the book, and John Mackey. Well, also Ben & Jerry's, still currently dealing with, what seemed to be a good mission lock back at 2001 when they were sold to Unilever with a mission board, but then that has proven not to be durable when things change. But with Whole Foods, the conscious capitalism movement and John Mackey really talking about, you don't even need to change your legal structure. You don't need these things. He actually was critical of B Corps and the Benefit Corp. He's like, you don't need that. You can just do the things, do your mission, be different. And then, of course, once his stock price went down, as you outline in the book, he had 8 consecutive quarters of declining sales. And then I think you had short-term activist shareholders buy in and sort of force a sale. He said, I wish we were a B Corp and Benefit Corporation, but maybe you could even speak about your take on Benefit Corps and the PBC, because I think that when they were first created, it was incredibly forward-thinking. And, this is 2010 when Maryland passed the first one, and it really sort of set the movement up for wow, you can be a different type of company than just a, you talk about in the book, like a general stock corporation, which is basically code language for maximize shareholder value. And at the same time, PBCs do not provide as much mission lock as some of the other things that you've mentioned. So maybe could you just go through here are some types of the mission?
Yeah. Let me give you a little overview. First of all, Whole Foods is one of the most tragic case studies in the book, I find. I think it's really very sad. And what's wild about it is, as much as I admire John Mackey, and I really do, and as much as I think conscious capitalism is great, if you read his own account of the story, there's this gaping black hole in the center of it that if you really look, it doesn't make any sense. Every decision that Whole Foods made from the time they took on VCs, he called them the hitchhikers with credit cards, right? They're, willing to go in the same direction as we are and willing to pay for gas, but not quite aligned, to the moment they went public and everything that happened to them in public markets. Everything was driven by this relentless need to keep the stock price up. Whenever they would do something that deviated from what Wall Street wanted, they'd be punished and the stock price would go down. And they worked really hard. And ultimately, the demise of their independence came from the fact that they would not lower prices. By the time they got to the point of declining same-store sales, it was because they wouldn't lower prices despite increased competition, because they knew that lowering prices would crash the stock price because Wall Street rewards high margins. Now, one of the big kind of maybe a little bit esoteric readings of my whole book is that we teach people that margins are a source of strength, but actually high margins are a source of weakness. Something that we can get into. But anyway, the need to keep the margins high drove all this behavior that caused them to inexorably lose their independence. So the activists who eventually broke Whole Foods, made something like $500 million on the transaction for 6 months of work. So pretty sweet deal. And if you read their own materials, they talk about how much value they created because they created this huge price premium for the shareholders of Whole Foods. They think they did a good job. But what's so interesting to me, when you ask people like, why is it important to have a high stock price? They'll be like, well, if you're greedy. But John Mackey had donated all his stock options to charity years before, so he wasn't greedy. They say, well, it's important if you want to acquire other companies. But Whole Foods had no trouble acquiring other companies, and they were long past that stage of their life, and that would be a consideration. They say, well, if you need to raise money. But Whole Foods was profitable every year and every quarter that it was a public company. It never needed to raise any money in the public markets. Even in 2008, when their stock crashed 90%, they were still break even. So like, why? So financial gravity created the problem that it then sent the activist to solve. So what we call value creating, like people call that a value creating transaction, but if you understand what it means to create value, you would say, no, at best, this value was transferred from Whole Foods' future into the pockets of the activists who did the transaction. So what do we do about this? It's just when you see the scale of the devastation that this force can create, it's obvious that one piece of armor is not going to get it done. I joke in the book that I call this the +2 pauldrons of invincibility. People think like, I've done one thing, so my shoulders are invulnerable. I'm going to charge out into battle. And it's like, but you're naked from the shoulders down, buddy. The spear that kills you may be aimed a little lower. So we have to have interlocking protection. So let's talk about the Public Benefit Corp, because I think this is the most misunderstood thing. I just did an event for a bunch of academics, like a bunch of students and first-time founders, maybe 60 or 70 people on the call. And they were like so confused. None of them were like, a bunch of people were like, is B Corp a real thing? What is it? And I was like, are you asking me about the B Lab certification? Are you asking me about the Public Benefit Corp statute? And they're like, I don't know. What are those? Like, they were genuinely confused. Like, they just didn't know. And even after I explained Public Benefit Corp to them, they still were like, but is that a B Corp? Like, what is that? And it's like, is that the same as a C Corp? Is not a C Corp anymore? Like, there's immense confusion. So the simple idea of a Public Benefit Corp, the reason it's so valuable is it blunts one vector, just one vector of attack, happens to be a very important one, what I call the fiduciary duty attack. In the history of the joint stock corporation, because it used to be considered obvious that companies existed to do a specific thing, to me, the PBC is just a restoration of that old idea that we should write the mission of a company into its charter. And instead of saying this company will pursue any lawful act or purpose, I always ask people, like, ask your lawyer if that includes turning your customers into Soylent Green. It's like, can we take that one off the table at least? And lawyers will be like, you never know. Best not to take anything off the table, maximum optionality. But then you ask, like, why does nobody trust me? I'll tell you why no one trusts you, because you won't promise that you won't kill them. That's pretty important. So by saying that this is what we exist to optimize for, we create a condition where the mission statement can be brought into alignment with the legal purpose. Now, personally, I don't think the PBC statutes go far enough, and I could think of lots of ways they could be improved. But at a bare minimum, that's the easiest, simplest thing that any entrepreneur can do, just establish the baseline. But that doesn't create mission lock. Because under Delaware law and most state law, the board of directors can still just decide to betray you anyway. For example, PBC is very useful if an evil company that you absolutely do not want to sell to offers to buy you for more than the company is worth. Under standard shareholder primacy law, you have no discretion. You must sell to the highest bidder. There's nothing you can do about it. With a PBC in place, your board can resist. You can say, no, our public benefit says that this would not be compatible with that. So you can apply a mission test to those kinds of transactions. But it doesn't force your board to do that. It gives your board the ability to do that. If your board is themselves captured by financial gravity, as most boards are, they can still betray you. And I have all kinds of betrayal stories in the book. That's why we have to have a mission guardian beyond just the PBC, someone to disrupt the voting attack and someone to disrupt the board voting attack. So there's a bunch of structures I discuss in the book. Obviously, founder control is pretty well known, creating what are called founders preferred shares. But there's lots of other ways you can do it. In Germany, they have co-determination, right? The placing of employees on the board has been shown to be an effective bulwark. Employees tend to be more mission aligned than outside investors. Lots of ways you can do it internally. For example, I advocate for something I call the director's oath. I think boards of directors should have the equivalent of a Hippocratic oath that they have to take as a condition of service. Again, that's a very easy thing to enact. You just write it into your corporate charter that no person can sit on this board unless they take this oath. Boom, done. There's a lot of evidence, by the way, that oaths work. So if you're like, that doesn't sound like it's very effective, look at the research, like CFOs who pledge to act ethically are like, I can't remember now, it's like 30% less likely to fudge earnings. Lots of proof that oaths are work. But again, None of those are really mission lock. Those are like bulwarks. For mission lock, we have to do what I call the mission locked constellation, where we have an outside entity that provides the control as a service. So for that, you want a perpetual purpose trust, a nonprofit foundation, an employee ownership trust, an ESOP, or a cooperative. There's like 10 others, as you well know, many other ways you could do it. But somebody who has the responsibility, and if you think about it in terms of political science, it makes sense. We understand in history that unicameral or like singular points of executive power are unstable. Emperors and kings, it's an unstable form of political power because you're dependent on the goodwill of an individual person. You create tremendous incentives for civil war to overthrow the crown and capture it. You just create a central point of failure that leads almost inevitably to corruption. That's why none of us want to live under an absolute monarchy. But multi-cameral, multi-point political structures are far more stable. The famous checks and balances, and as the Federalist Papers said, the ability of faction to balance against faction. So that's kind of how I see organizations really. Every organization is actually like a little bubble of utopia, like a little spaceship. And inside the spaceship is an environment that somebody decided this is the optimal, the correct way that human beings should share power. And that's why some organizations are very brutal and hierarchical, and others are more egalitarian and communitarian. And everything in between. There are more varieties of organization than even of ancient Greek city-states. But like every person who sets up an organization can ask themselves, you want to be a little more like Athens or a little more like Sparta? Like you get to decide what you want it to be. And the beautiful thing about organizations is that as they metabolize the outside world, they grow. They make more of the outside world into their little bubble of utopia. That's what they are. So this is the most ancient human birthright. Human beings, from the second there have been human beings, have been experimenting wildly with how they can organize themselves through all these cool projects. If you've never studied this history, it's incredible. If you don't know what schismogenesis is, the ability of organizations of polities to define themselves in opposition to a different polity and amplify their differences, we see all those same phenomena in organizational life. And yet we're being told that the best practices require a really severe monoculture that I think is a profound loss in the sense of possibility. So those of us who are entrepreneurs and leaders and board members, especially who are listening, you have had your birthright taken from you. These techniques have generally been hidden. They're not well studied, or if they're studied as an old thing that we don't do anymore. But you can still do them. There's no reason they should be in the distant past. We could do them starting right now. And so, yeah, that's that combination of these techniques working together like a plate mail suit of armor. That's really what I advocate for in the book.
Maybe let's take it to an example level. So let's imagine two different entrepreneurs that you're advising. One is like, I've thought about this a lot. I'm going to launch a business. It sells widgets or whatever. I'm not sure if it's ever going to go big, but like I want the mission lock, right? So there's like someone starting from scratch. So you're sort of advising that. And then there's the second person is like, we're a going concern. We've already got a bunch of investors on board. We're going to be filing our S1, but like now we're freaked out because we want to do mission lock before we go big. So give me some thoughts on like those two scenarios. Like, what would you advise?
I have actually been in both those scenarios. I tell a bunch of these stories in the book. It's funny, when Robert Wood Johnson II took Johnson & Johnson public in the 1940s, literally during World War II, he was so worried about this that he created the famous Johnson & Johnson Our Credo, 4-part credo that first priority is patients, doctors, and nurses, second priority employees, third priority communities, fourth priority is shareholders. Shareholders, anytime someone writes one of these credos, it's always shareholders last. The exact opposite of what we teach now is the best practice. Why are all these great companies organized around the opposite of today's best practices? What's going on? So anyway, he was so worried that the company might deviate from these principles that he did like the classic thing that entrepreneurs do that is so inadequate. He had them carved into 8-foot-high limestone blocks and inscribed upon the walls of the company headquarters where they exist to this day. You cannot work at Johnson & Johnson without walking by those principles every day on your way to work. And yet that is not strong enough. If you know the history of Johnson & Johnson, you know that in recent decades, it has been rocked by scandal after scandal after scandal, all of which can be traced back to the gradual capture of the board by financial gravity. You could pick, but I think the worst of these scandals is the putting of asbestos in the baby powder and then covering it up. We know because, of course, these things always come out. Eventually, we have the documents. You can just read the deliberation where they're like, yeah, this is going to cause cancer, but we can't let people know it might ruin the share price. Like, how sad. The thing you ought to understand, and I tell this to both the IPO prepping people and the very naive beginner founder just starting out, the people who put asbestos in the baby powder walked by the Credo every day on their way to work. Financial gravity is an unconscious value transmission. Even the people doing it don't always realize they're doing it. So if you think you're the exception to this rule, you are kidding yourself. You need to be prepared. So if you already have investors, you already are doing a transaction, it's more complicated because we need their consent. But I have a whole section in the book called How to Talk to Your Investors about this. And the number one most important thing I tell entrepreneurs, practice this in front of the mirror until you can say it with confidence. Okay? It's very simple. Since I am the founder or the leader, as the leader, it is my judgment that it is essential to our strategy that we be a trustworthy counterparty to person X, to customers, to patients, to employees, whatever the most vital resource is. And in order to be trustworthy, we have to do this technique because for this reason. And it's like a little Mad Lib. You practice saying that over and over and over and over again. What you'll find is that most investors have never given this even 2 seconds of thought. So it's not that they're like opposed to your idea in particular. They're just reflexively opposed to everything. Because they've been taught that the best practice is for all companies to be the same. They have been taught that the monoculture of shareholder primacy is the best. But if you ask them why, they have no idea. That's just what they were taught as an orthodoxy. And it's funny, all these bold contrarians, you can hear the same people who understand that in venture, there's not a dollar to be made unless you're different from everybody else, will be like, you don't want to be too different from the other companies because you might not be able to raise money if anything's weird. And you're like, my kingdom for a bold contrarian,
Well, I think it's because they're probably captured by the financial gravity of having to repay the fund to their LPs.
Of course. And if they don't want to look bad in front of their LPs and they have all these worries, right? So, okay, that's perfectly natural. But at the end of the day, by phrasing your desire to do this in competitive terms, so this is an essential element of our strategy, you force people to object to something specific. Which part of my chain of logic do you disagree with? I'm not the leader. It's not my decision to make. You don't agree with my judgment. You don't think trust is not part of our strategy, actually? This is not a vital resource. This technique won't work. Object to something specific, and then let me address your objection. And if you read my book, you will be armed with every possible counter to every one of these objections, because I've seen them all, and I know how they can be answered. Because at the end of the day, we have the evidence that this way of working is superior just from a value creation point of view. You don't need any environmental, ethical, or moral arguments to win. Those are nice. You can use those too. Of course, I believe they're true. But shareholder primacy fails its own test of value maximization. It is value destroying. There's a whole chart in the book in chapter 9 called Best Practices Destroy Shareholder Value. Not says Eric, says all these academic studies. I just list study after study after study. This is why, this is why, this is why. So that's for if you already are in that complicated situation. Now, if you're not yet in a complicated situation, you have the advantage. Just do it. I strongly recommend just build the mission lock in from the beginning. It's so much easier. And people don't do it, A, because they're lazy. And they're like, this seems like work I could put off till later, but it's always too early till it's too late. So you may be able to put it off till later, but you may lose. I think the big misconception people have is they think, and investors and lawyers encourage this fantasy, the more success you have, the more power you'll have. The more power you have, the more freedom you'll have. So if you want to do things a certain way, do it later when you'll be more powerful. This is true. You will have more power. But they conveniently leave out this tiny little detail, which is the more successful you are as an organization, the more valuable you become as a target. Since trustworthiness is the most valuable asset in the world today, if you stockpile it, someone will try to steal it from you. What'd you expect? So instead of postponing, do it now. Now, people say to me, I want to do that, but I'm worried I won't be able to raise money if I have an unusual structure.
What is it? What is that actual, I really like the Novo Nordisk. Do you have a go-to?
In general, you're better off just copying somebody, copy a template and then customize. So yeah, I happen to really like the Novo Nordisk structure, which is a nonprofit foundation that owns a for-profit subsidiary. That's very easy to set up. It's not that complicated. You don't even need to start the nonprofit foundation on day one. You just write into the corporate charter that this structure is.
Yeah, because I can imagine entrepreneurs being like, I'm just trying to start a business, not a nonprofit foundation also. But I like the idea.
People say that, but not really. If you think science is a public trust, as the founders of Novo Nordisk did, then either put that, my point is stop claiming to be mission driven and then chicken out when you find out what being mission driven requires. Such people are only mission hopeful. And I would prefer if they just close their mouth. Just admit that you're not serious about it and get on with it. For the people that are serious about it, these structures are well studied. Just to give you one example, companies that have the industrial foundation structure, that's the Novo Nordisks of the world, there's enough of them that we have a data set. they are 6 times more likely to live to year 50. 6 times, 60% versus 10% compared to conventional structures. So if that's important to you, if you want to have the kind of company your grandkids can be proud that you're the founder of instead of having to hide it, we have the template. We know how to do it. Right now, since AI is the hottest thing on the planet, for better or for worse, given that Anthropic has that structure, I tell people, like, just copy what Anthropic did, like, at a minimum, because the number one objection you'll hear from VCs is you won't be able to raise money with the structure. And Anthropic is like the ultimate counterexample. Like, they seem like they raise a little money, so that doesn't seem to be the issue. But yes, just pick something. And the nice thing about doing it at the beginning, before you have shareholders especially, is it turns your corporate charter into like a fun design exercise instead of to like a building permit. So like, if you really put a gun to my head and said, look, you have to pick something without knowing, obviously you want it to be customized to the situation. But if you told me without knowing, what would you do? Is I would do founder control, because founder control will give you the right to make future changes if you get it wrong. So some level of founder control, founders preferred shares. I would do a public benefit corp conversion. I would write the mission into the PBC benefit statement. I would require directors to take an oath in support of that statement. I would have the board seats be conditioned on various forms of mission guardianship. So the founder maybe appoints certain people. The investors can appoint directors, but only if they've taken the pledge. And then I would reserve some of the seats on the board for the appointment by a spiritual holding company entity. And I would just, if it was me, I would just write into the charter that 10% of the equity and 1% of future revenues are hereby pledged to the future foundation that we will set up, along with 3 board seats or whatever, however you want to do it. What I just described to you is like not that complicated. A competent lawyer can write you this document and it will not be that expensive to do. And then you can always change your mind. You can always take it out later. But the most important thing is, when you're meeting with investors, if they want to invest in your company, they will start telling you a beautiful story about how much they believe in you. You're just the greatest founder they ever met. Your vision is singular. They will back you. Like, so many VCs are founder friendly. That's what they call themselves. And I know a lot of founder friendly VCs that have stabbed founders in the back ruthlessly, and then be like, look, you can tell people about it, but who are you going to believe? You know, it's going to be bad for all our reputations if you make a sting. And so the stories of these betrayals don't get out. So when you have these structures in place, you have a really interesting opportunity to find out who's for real and who's not. Because the kind of VC that says, I believe in you, I love your vision, you're a genius, but I do need the ability to fire you at any time, is very different from someone who's like, I love this structure, this is really smart. So just take that into account when deciding who to raise money from.
One of the founders that I've been speaking with, who I actually shared your book with, you gave me permission, he has a question that I wanted to pose to you.
Yeah, let's hear it.
So they're in this pre-IPO situation. And what he's being told is the more you mandate specific behaviors in governance documents, the more you create a documented checklist that plaintiff attorneys can use against directors years later. And if the charter says something like directors shall ensure the company pursues its public benefit purpose and something goes wrong, that language becomes Exhibit A in a lawsuit. And so the sort of question is, one, is that just lawyers doing the thing that they do, which is push back on any sort of thing, or does that have some validity? And then, like, what are 2 or 3 specific mission guardian things a bank, like a company, trying to, in this pre-IPO phase, could put in that could help?
Yeah. That is true, but let me explain why I think it's very much misunderstood. So I'm sure everyone listening knows Google's famous "Don't be evil" ethos. For those who don't know, when Google went public, before they went public, an engineer wrote this on a whiteboard in one of the IPO planning meetings, just to remind everybody, like, don't be evil. And they adopted that as their motto. It's all over their S1 filing. It used to be a very prominently displayed on their website. And over the years, the prominence of don't be evil has gone down and down and down to the point now where, like, you can hardly find it anywhere. But anyway, it survived long enough that one of the last places in the company it said don't be evil was in the employee handbook. It was literally on the last page of the employee handbook. It said such and such and such, but notwithstanding the 200 pages of policies beforehand, our motto is don't be evil. So if you see something, say something like that. And as a result, Google has been sued, not once, but twice, for violating the don't be evil pledge. Once by former employees and once by investors. They have had to settle both lawsuits. So in my world, when the first of these lawsuits was settled, it was big news. And a lot of people wanted to talk to me about it. And they divided very evenly into 2 camps. One camp was who the people your friend is talking to. See, that's why you don't put stuff like that in your company handbook. You're just going to get sued over it. And the other camp was like, see, that's why you don't put stuff in there unless you actually intend to do it. The reason you get sued is because you're full of it. You want the virtue signal of having said you're doing it without being serious. So if you think about public companies, people say public companies are untrustworthy and unpredictable because they're maligned. True. But they're not completely untrustworthy and completely unpredictable. There's certain things we know for sure they will do. For example, they will file their quarterly reports on time.
Soon as the sun will rise the next day, right?
As certain as the sun will rise, they will file it. And I remember I did this exercise with an ex-Googler, and I tell the story in the book. I said, okay, as certain as the sun will rise, they'll file the quarterly report. What about, do you think there's any situation where Google might inadvertently kill somebody? He was like, no, probably not. I was like, yeah, but give me a probability, like 100%? He's like, well, 100%? I don't know about that. What if the self-driving car hit somebody? What if he starts going through all the scenarios? Google's been sued for bad behavior quite a few times and had to settle a lot of these lawsuits. It was like, gosh, I'm not sure how to put a probability. I was like, but not as certain as the sun will rise. So how is that possible that we can be sure companies will report on time? We can't sure if they'll commit manslaughter. Is it because human beings have an instinctive love of quarterly reporting and are morally ambiguous on the question of manslaughter? Like, no, come on, that's absurd. This is not a human nature thing. The reason we can be sure that companies will do this thing is they have built a massive, incredibly expensive apparatus to make sure it happens. So if you're going to put promises in your documents, yeah, you're going to get sued either way. The idea that this somehow is going to make it more like you're going to get sued, okay? But be prepared to defend yourself. And the flip side is, okay, if the lawyers are right, we don't want to get sued, but you also want people to trust you. So if you're like, I reserve the right to betray you at any time, that's never going to happen. You're never going to be trusted. Now, there are a bunch of things you can do. The lawyers are being a little bit, I think, deceptive in the way they're talking to your friend. Because we can put high-level statements of purpose into our documents if we want. We don't need checklists. What we need are tools so that if someone pressures us to do the wrong thing, we can point to this. And the fact that you might be sued is the most valuable ammunition you have when you're trying to force people to do the right thing. So like, I remember talking to somebody, I shouldn't say the name of the company, I guess. And he was telling me that their founder had insisted they put it in the charter that they were going to do all this good stuff. And he said it was extremely valuable because people would show up and say, why are you spending all this money on this? We think you should be giving that money back to shareholders as dividends or whatever. He'd be like, I hear you, man. I want to do that too. But look, sorry, our charter requires. If we didn't do that, we get sued. And they'd be like, oh, okay. It was like an instant understanding. Oh, I see. Oh, I'm so sorry. Sorry for you. Like, but yes, I guess you just have to waste that money on that thing. You make a requirement and it's like, well, we can't argue about it. So the things you can do before an IPO that are easy, okay? Founder control. Just do founder control. Like people are getting used to it. Founder controlled companies outperform non-founder controlled companies. So like it's becoming more and more problematic for investors to oppose it. Don't do the sunset though. That's a huge mistake people make. So don't do the sunset. Just do regular founder control as a bridge. I think that's good. I think do a purpose trust. Purpose trust, super easy to do. No reason not to do it. Do purpose trust plus PPC. You can do that at any time up to an IPO. It's increasingly understood. And if people say, I don't understand why you do this, be like, well, it's worked for Patagonia, so it's good enough. Or it's like working for Anthropic. Just use the precedents for it. If you want to do the industrial foundation, you can do that too. If you're rich enough to do an IPO, you can do all this stuff. IPOs are insanely expensive. If you can afford to do an IPO, you can afford to do these other things. There are other things that are kind of a little bit more clever if you want. For example, most IPOs these days feature what's called an evergreen stock plan provision, in which we don't just say like, because we know, by the way, we know in the research, I don't think I mentioned this before, employee ownership is a huge source of competitive advantage. I don't know if people know this, but like the evidence shows that the more employee ownership you have, the more growth you have, the more all kinds of resilience you get. There was a big meta study that was done with a huge data set of companies. And it found that not only does employee owner, like if you're 100% employee owned, you get this big advantage, but they showed that employee ownership exhibits dose response, just like a medication. So the difference between 0%, 10%, 50%, and 100%, you'll get more of the benefits of employee ownership. You just get more if you do more. So since you have an evergreen stock plan, generally speaking, employees mint new shares every year for the purpose of rewarding their top talent. So their employee ownership share, in theory, should grow over time. You can do what I call community evergreen. If you're going to do 4%, just make it 5% and say the extra 1% we're going to use for, accumulating the stock into our endowment or into a community, like just some other thing that is important to you. You pick what it is, pick stuff like that. Again, people aren't going to like it, but they already didn't like it at 4%. They're not going to like it that much. There's like no difference at 5. Like people like, oh, investors might not like it, but you know what? At the end of the day, investors either want the growth that you provide or they don't. All these other provisions, all these other complaints, they don't really make a difference. And the last thing I'll give a tip for your friend, a very common mistake people make is they allow the banks to control the allocation of shares in the IPO. So I once did this exercise. I was helping a friend in the same situation. He had gotten the RFPs from all the banks. And in those documents, they often tell you which funds they're planning to allocate to. Now at LTSC, we happen to have the data set of all the different at the sub fund level. We can tell you for any given investor how long-term they actually are as it relates to companies like you. And so we said, listen, give us all the RFPs. We'll sort all the recommended funds and we'll score them red, yellow, green by how long-term they are. And I remember doing the presentation. I was showing him the data. I said, here's page 1. And he's like, oh, that doesn't look so bad. It was like, 3 greens, 10 yellows, and like 25 reds. He's like, well, that's actually better than I thought. I'm just like, oh, sorry, my mistake. This is page 1. Let me click to page 2, all red. Page 3, all red. Page 4, all red. Most investors who invest in IPO are gone within 2 quarters. Even though you meet them on the roadshow, they look into your soul and they tell you, we believe in this company. It's all bullshit. So another thing you can do is, first of all, allocate to long-term investors, even if that means you don't get the highest possible price. What do you need the highest possible price in your IPO date for? That's a total vanity metric. Don't be duped. Get long-term investors on your cap table. The data shows companies that have long-term investors that own them have all these advantages. We'll get into it now. But the other thing you can do is what's called tenured or long-term voting. Make investors' voting power proportionate to their holding period. We can do this very easily these days because of a system. The SEC mandates called DRS, the direct registration system. So I won't get into all the details, but those who are interested, if your friend is interested, have them call me. I can show them exactly how to do it.
Is this like the one, if you hold it for 1 year, you get 1 vote, 2 years, you get 2 votes type thing?
Yeah, 2 years, 2 votes. And you can make it continuous. Like the funny thing is that people treat these systems like they're like handed down by God, but companies control their own voting rules. You can have whatever you want. So just have it be what you want.
Well, Eric, as we're moving towards wrapping, what have we not discussed or anything else that you think is really critical for kind of the Next Economy listener to know, or anything about the book that you think would be useful for them as they're thinking about how to apply it to their daily life?
So we've been talking primarily about the stuff from what is part 2 of the book, the blueprint, the mechanics of how we do this protection. And there's actually a part 3 of the book that talks about what I call mission transmission. And this is something I think a lot of people in this economy, even who are interested in the new economy, don't really understand. So for example, I've worked with a lot of mission-driven companies, and because we're all in this defensive crouch and we're so beleaguered, we get surprised when we go from like unpopular to popular. It's like like a movie when the main character goes through a big glow up and now they're super popular all of a sudden. Like we're kind of like that. So I know a lot of people who, when they go through this transformation, they're so used to begging for money and they can't get money. They start to unconsciously see investors as their superiors. And when they finally have money and they finally are the hot date at the dance, and now everybody wants to invest, they start to give out allocation thoughtlessly. But actually, like who you give allocation to is an example of what I call mission transmission. Whenever a transaction happens, if it wasn't scored against mission advancement, you're actually transmitting somebody else's values. So if you take the fanciest investor, the highest tier investor, the one who has the slickest marketing, then you're no better than the person who's like, well, it's just more convenient to buy on Amazon. So I can't. It's like you're voting with your feet for the values you want to see in the world. And this concept, I use it in the 3rd part of the book to develop a bunch of ideas around the importance of standards, obviously like B Labs and Purpose Pledge, so important, not just to lead initiatives, but to follow initiatives. I can't tell you how many CEOs will only sign up for a thing that they themselves originate. So we have a world of leaders with no followers. We got to be good leaders. We got to be good followers. But also I'll have a whole chapter on what I call civic infrastructure, which are the institutions that can create the capacity, our society's capacity for collective action. And I think entrepreneurs should tackle those kinds of problems to be more eager to do so. But anyway, the mission transmission concept is really important for organizations. Like I think most organizations, I can't tell you how many people I know, even mission-driven people, like have their money in the stock market, just in a regular old mutual fund or ETF. The ETF is advised by a governance advisory firm who's voting those shares in contravention of your own values. Like get your money out of those things. Don't lend your gravitational influence to people who are opposed to your values. What are you doing? But we also have that problem as individuals. We don't realize how much transmission power we all have. And I know people at the end of the book, I felt bad adding this as a final chapter where I explained this. And I apologize because some people are like, finally, a whole book about systemic solutions to systemic problems. And now you want to talk about personal agency at the end, as if we could solve climate change by recycling. Like, come on, man. I understand. I'm pissed off about it too. But we live in the age of surveillance capitalism, which means that no matter what decision you make, every decision in your life, even if you never tell anybody, is somebody else's OKR. There's some middle manager somewhere in the economy whose bonus depends on getting you to do or not do that exact thing. As humble as you chose Coke or Pepsi, As complicated as you decided to make your house LEED certified or have it be a polluting house, like whether you drive a hybrid or a electric car, whether you go work at company A or company B, whether you decide to stay late to get a promotion or not, every decision you make sends gravitational ripples all through the economy. And so as a result, I think, again, in the next economy crowd, we tend to talk about these as what are called collective action problems, which is good. Obviously, they are collective action problems. And we have a lot of places where we want to have catalysts, activists, and people who create collective action. But one of the downsides of talking about it that way is it kind of implicitly sends the message that there's no point in doing the right thing unless you can be sure that lots of other people are going to do the right thing too. And as a result, many of us don't do the right thing. If you read the literature on authoritarianism, this is a common trope that, like, again, I was talking about the normative consensus. If everyone thinks, everybody else agrees. Václav Havel called it living in truth, that at a certain point, you have to just make the decision that you're going to live your life in accordance with your values and accept whatever those consequences are. And it can start in very humble ways. So I'll give an example that someone came to me for advice the other day. They were a test reader of the book, and they read the book and they said, I'm really excited. I want to be part of this. What can I do? I need a job. So can you help me in my job search apply these principles? And I said, sure, I can help you. He said, well, but here's the caveat. I'm not a courageous person. So what can I do if I'm not brave? Like, I really need a job. What can I do? And I was like, okay, I'll give you something you can do that requires 100% no courage. Here's what you're going to do. You're going to go to your job interviews. At the end of every interview, they're going to say, do you have any questions? And you're going to say, are you a mission-driven company? Just asking. Of course, they're going to say yes. Yeah. And you say, great. How do you know? And they say, oh, well, my boss is really nice to me and we don't work on weekends and we have free beer on Fridays or whatever. I don't know what they're going to say. They're going to say a bunch of stuff. Whatever they say, be like, that's super cool. Oh, that sounds awesome. Is that in the corporate charter too? And I guarantee you, the person you're asking this question to is going to say, I don't know. I'll have to get back to you on that. Now, here's the thing. And again, don't be rude about it. You don't have to jump on the table and be like, therefore, blah. Just, oh, yeah, I'd love to know. And here's the power of that. You just asked a question, perfectly humble question, nothing wrong. No one, you didn't get red flagged for asking. But I guarantee you, every company that runs a interview process, there is somebody whose job is to make sure that every question that a candidate asks of an interviewer is in the list of frequently asked questions that every interviewer is prepped with and they know the answer to, which means somebody is going to have to go ask their boss, hey, boss, what is the answer to this question? And you know what? She's not going to know either. And she's going to have to ask her boss. And I have actually been in board meetings where this kind of thing comes up. A candidate asks a question and we don't know the answer. What is the answer? And you never know. Maybe the CEO has been wanting to become a public benefit corp and has been looking for an excuse to do it. And they will seize on this as like, oh, actually, look, see, by doing this, we'll have a talent advantage. People are already starting to ask. That's from one person asking the question. What if 2 people asked? What if 10 people asked? No courage required. Now, after you get used to doing the zero courage option, maybe you'll be willing to take it a little further, but just take that first step of living in truth. You might be surprised how powerful it is.
Well, Eric, as we wrap up, we often ask, what do you need right now? And how can the listeners best support your work?
Support me? Gosh, oh man. Well, first of all, I have this book coming out on May 26th. So if you have an author in your life, okay, you don't understand how valuable it is to pre-order a book, to buy it the first week it comes out, help the book be a bestseller out the gate.
You're like on Amazon. Just kidding.
Yeah, well, right. So if you really want to do me a favor, okay, here's my ask, Ryan, maybe you'll do this for me. If you really want to make my day and make somebody else's day at the same time, all you have to do is call your local bookstore. Don't do it on Amazon. Go to a local bookstore. You can call them, or of course you can do it online and just say, hey, I'd like 20 copies of Incorruptible the day it comes out. Will you do that for me? Now, whoever you call, you're about to make their day. They're going to be the happiest independent bookseller you've ever talked to, because it is so hard to be an independent bookseller right now. The pressure on them is enormous, and it's so convenient to buy on Amazon. So you can just do that. They'll be happy to order the books. They'll be happy to give them to you, and just give them out to other people you know. Everyone listening to this podcast knows a ton of mission-driven entrepreneurs and leaders and people who are interested in this. And most of those people eventually are going to read this book. I really believe it. But they're not going to necessarily read it week 1. But if you put it in their hand, you accelerate the process of the idea getting out there. So if you want to do that for me, then I will consider it a personal favor. If you want to learn more about the book, you can do so at incorruptible.co. Incorruptible.co is the website. You can join my mailing list. I have tried to create every conceivable bonus and benefit you get for joining the mailing list, and for pre-ordering the book. You can get implementation guides for early stage and for later stage companies. Your friend will have some good stuff for her or him. We have reader's guides. We have special author Q&As and lots of cool stuff. And if you want to get the book online, of course you can. We have links to all the places you can do so, including lots of indie bookstores. You can buy it in hardcover, in ebook, and even in audiobook. The audiobook also has a bunch of cool bonus content in it that I think is pretty neat. So really appreciate everybody who helps spread the message, who leaves a review online, who posts about it on social media. Like, the thing about being an author, and I learned this with Lean Startup, you are the steward of a movement. And you wind up being the face of it in a way that I think is actually kind of unfair. I always maybe a little bit uncomfortable that people attribute the whole movement to me personally, as if I did it. No, we do it. And so, for those that like the message of this book, if you will be part of that movement, you can have the private satisfaction of knowing that we ended the era of shareholder primacy and ushered in something new that our children and grandchildren will be really proud of us for having done.
Beautiful. Eric, thanks so much for being on the show, and we'll have to have you back at some point in the future.
I look forward to it. Yeah, this has been really fun.
Hey, Next Economy Now listeners. If you enjoyed this conversation and are looking to dive even deeper into the B Corp movement, you'll love our new podcast, Beyond the B, hosted by Lyft Economy's Amy Allison and me, Ryan Honeyman. Beyond the B is your insider's guide to the B Corp movement. You'll learn about the new B Corp standards shaping our community, how the B Corp movement is navigating the various tensions and challenges of growth, and how businesses like Patagonia are putting their commitments to people and planet in practice. Check out our latest episodes and free resources at lifteconomy.com/beyond. You can also subscribe to Beyond the B on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks again for listening.